The first snow of 1884 came early to Harlan County, Minnesota. It came without announcement the way most difficult things do a gray morning, that looked like every other gray morning. And then by noon, the sky had dropped so low you could feel the weight of it pressing down on the dry grass. And by dark, there was a thin white crust on everything on the fence posts and the woodpile and the coal black soil that Edmund Vane had worked for 11 years. Harriet Vane stood at the window and watched it fall. She was 67 years old. She had survived 2 droughts, 1 grasshopper plague, the death of a child in 1869 before he had a name, and 31 Minnesota winters. She had taught school for 8 years before Edmund came along and gave her a reason to stop. She had buried her mother, her father, and her younger sister, each one in a different state, each one in a different decade. She was not a woman who fell apart easily. But she had never stood at a window watching the first snowfall, knowing that she was the only person left in the house. Edmund had been dead for 7 weeks. She kept counting it in weeks because months felt too permanent. 7 weeks sounded like a number that might still change. 7 weeks sounded like something a person could survive. A month and 3/4 sounded like forever. He had died on a Tuesday in September, which seemed wrong to Harriet in a way she could not explain. Important things should happen on important days. Edmund dying on an ordinary Tuesday while the sun was still up and the cattle were making their regular sounds in the field that had seemed like a mistake. Like the world had miscalculated. Like someone somewhere had confused the date with another date and the whole thing would be corrected once the error was discovered. No correction came. He had been cutting wood. That was the part that stayed with Harriet in the long quiet nights that followed. Not the fever that came after, not the 3 days when the infection moved through him like a tide that only went one direction. Not even the moment near the end when he had looked at her with eyes that already seemed to be seeing something she couldn't. What stayed was the image of Edmund in the yard that September morning. The axe in his hands, the woodpile growing beside him, and the knowledge that he had been doing exactly what a good man was supposed to do. Preparing, getting ready, building up the stores that would carry them through. The axe had slipped. A small thing. The kind of small thing that happens to careful men on ordinary Tuesdays. The blade had caught his left palm, not deep, not dramatic, the kind of cut that stings and bleeds and then stops bleeding, and a man wraps a rag around it and keeps working because there is always more work to do in September. Edmund had wrapped a rag around it and kept working. By Friday it was red. By Sunday it was worse. By Tuesday, a week to the day, Edmund Vane was dead of a wound that should have been nothing on a Tuesday that had no right to be the last day of anything. He left her with half a woodpile. She had counted the cords the morning after the funeral while the neighbors were still clearing the dishes from the table and talking in low voices about what a good man Edmund had been and what a shame it all was. She had counted because someone had to, because the world did not stop requiring firewood just because a good man died in it. She had walked out to the woodpile in her good dress and her good shoes with the cold coming through the leather, and she had counted each cord with the deliberate care of a woman who understood that the numbers were going to matter regardless of how she felt about them. The numbers did not work. 6 cords, maybe 6.5 if she was generous in her counting. A winter in Harlan County required 10-12 in a bad year. The kind of winter that was already showing itself in the weight of that early November sky could go higher than that. She was 67 years old with hands that ached in the cold and a back that reminded her of its age every morning when she rose and there was no way, no honest, physical, practical way that she could cut the wood herself. Not in the time remaining, not with the body she had. The neighbors had told her not to worry about it. They had said it the way people say things they do not intend to follow through on, with warmth and sincerity in the moment, and the full understanding that by next week they would have their own wood piles to worry about their own families, to feed their own arithmetic that did not include a widow down the road. Harriet had watched their faces while they said it. She had been a school teacher. She knew the difference between a promise and a courtesy, and she knew which one she was receiving. She had nodded and thanked them and then gone back to counting. The barn was where she went when she needed to think without being watched. It had always been that way even when Edmund was alive. The barn had a quality of privacy that the house did not, a rough plainness that asked nothing of you and judged nothing about you and simply stood around you while you worked out whatever needed working out. She went there the afternoon after the funeral when the last of the neighbors had gone, and she sat on the overturned feed bucket that had been her thinking seat for 11 years, and she looked at the tools hanging on the wall, and the equipment Edmund had kept in meticulous order, and the wooden toolbox in the corner that she had been walking past for 3 weeks without opening. She was not sure why she opened it that afternoon rather than any other. The light was going, and her feet were cold, and there was no practical reason to be in the barn at all. But she got up from the bucket and crossed to the corner and lifted the lid of the toolbox, and she looked at the chisels and the spare nails and the small folded diagrams Edmund sometimes made for projects he was planning. She found those things. She also found a folded piece of paper wedged under the tray of nails written in Edmund's careful hand, dated December of the previous winter. She stood in the middle of the barn and read it by the gray light coming through the door. It was not long. Edmund was not a man who wasted words even on paper. It said, "Spoke with Britta Solberg past the creek about how she keeps her cabin warm on so little wood. She says trap the air between the wall and a hanging. Keep it still 2 inches at least. Still air does not move the heat out. She's been doing it for 40 years. Look into this before next winter." Before next winter. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time slowly, the way you read something when you want to be certain you are understanding it correctly and not just understanding what you hoped it would say. He had known. He had found the solution to the problems she was now living inside, and he had tucked the note away and gone back to work, and then September had come, and the axe had slipped, and next winter had arrived without him. He had been preparing for this winter. He had been thinking about her warmth, about the two of them in this cabin, through the cold months, about the problem he had identified and the solution he had found and the work he intended to do before the first snow fell. He had not gotten to do it, but he had written it down. Harriet stood in the barn for a long time with that note in her hand. The cattle moved in their stalls with the patient sounds of animals settling in for the evening. The light through the door went from gray to a deeper gray that was almost dark. She stood there and she let the full weight of what the note meant move through her, not just the practical meaning, the solution to the arithmetic that had not been working, but the other meaning underneath it. The meaning that said Edmund had been thinking about next winter. That said he had expected to be here for it. That said he had found a thing he wanted to give her and had not had the chance. She was going to have the chance. She folded the note carefully and put it in the pocket of her dress close to her body, where she could feel its edges when she moved. She went inside. She made coffee. She sat at the table where Edmund had sat across from her for 31 years, and she drank it alone with the note in her pocket, in the half wood pile in the yard, and the first thin coat of snow on everything outside the window. By morning, she knew what she was going to do. She drove the first peg into the north wall on a Monday. The wood was hard and her hands ached, and the hammer was heavier than she remembered it being, but she drove it in. The sound of it was good, solid, purposeful, the sound of a nail going where it was meant to go. She drove the next one 18 inches from the first, then another. She worked slowly, deliberately, the way a woman works when she cannot afford to make a mistake and cannot afford to stop checking each peg before she moved to the next, making sure the wood held before she trusted it with weight. The quilt she chose for the north wall was the heaviest one. She had a double wedding ring pattern that Edmund's mother had made before either of them was born, thick with cotton batting, heavy enough to hang straight and still without bunching or swinging. She had laid all the quilts out across the bed the night before, touching each one as she decided its placement, feeling the batting thickness through the fabric the way a doctor feels for something under the skin. She had arranged them in order of weight, heaviest for the north, where the wind came down from Canada, without a single hill to slow it, medium weight for the east and west, something lighter for the south where the window broke the wall. She measured 2 inches from the wall with a stick she had notched for the purpose. She strung the rope between the pegs and hung the quilt from it and stepped back and checked the gap at 3 points along the wall-top, middle, bottom. 2 inches at every point. The quilt hung plumb and straight, and behind it was a layer of air that was now for the first time trapped. She looked at it. It looked strange. There was no other word for it. It looked like something a woman did when she had lost her grip on how things were supposed to be done, when grief had untethered her from the ordinary logic of domestic life. It looked like a quilt on a wall, instead of a bed, which was exactly what it was, which was exactly what she needed it to be. She held this contradiction for a moment and then set it aside because there was more work to do and the north wall was only one of 4. She drove the next peg and kept working. Constance Morrow arrived at 10:30. She did not knock. In fairness, she rarely knocked. It was a habit of the minister's wife. This comfortable assumption that all doors in the settlement were open to her, that her presence was always welcome because her intentions were always good. She was 65 years old, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, with the particular authority of a woman who had spent decades being the most organized person in every room she entered. She wore steel-rimmed spectacles that she adjusted whenever she wished to communicate disapproval, which was frequently, and she adjusted them now as she came through the door and stopped and looked at the north wall and looked at Harriet and looked at the north wall again. "Harriet," she said, "what in heaven's name are you doing?" Harriet did not stop working. "Insulating," she said. "Those are quilts, they are. Quilts belong on beds." Constance's voice carried the tone of a woman explaining something to someone who should already know it. "You wrap yourself in a quilt. You don't hang it on a wall like a painting." Harriet drove another peg. "A painting hangs flat against the wall," she said. "This hangs 2 inches away. That's the part that matters." Constance approached the north wall and looked at it more closely. She looked at the notched stick Harriet had set on the windowsill. She looked at the rope. She looked at Edmund's mother's quilt hanging straight and still with the 2-inch gap of air between its back and the rough log wall. She looked at all of it the way a woman looks at something she has already decided is wrong and is now gathering specific evidence to support that decision. "You're grieving," Constance said. Her voice had shifted into a softer register, the one that meant she was about to say something she expected to be resisted. "It's understandable. You've had a terrible loss, and the mind does strange things when it's under this kind of strain. But Harriet, hanging quilts on walls is not going to get you through winter. You need firewood. You need help. You need to think practically about your situation." "I am thinking practically about my situation," Harriet said. "That's why I'm hanging quilts on walls." The minister's wife drew herself up to her full height, which was considerable, and took a breath that suggested she was calling on reserves of patience she kept for difficult occasions. "The Women's Auxiliary is meeting Thursday," she said. "Several of us have discussed your circumstances, and we feel strongly that some form of organized assistance is warranted. A woman alone going into winter with insufficient resources, it's not something the community can simply ignore. We want to help you think through your options. We want to help you transition." Harriet set down her hammer and looked at Constance Morrow directly for the first time since she had come in. "Transition to what?" she said. "To something more manageable, something more suitable for a woman in your situation." Constance paused with the delicacy of someone about to say a difficult thing that they have already decided needs to be said. "You can't prove up this claim without Edmund. We all understand that, and there's no shame in acknowledging what's practical. Reverend Morrow knows a family in Duluth who is looking for someone to help with the household. It would be a warm place, regular meals, companionship." "Thank you for coming," Harriet said. She picked up her hammer. "Harriet." Constance's voice took on the firm edge of a woman who is not accustomed to being dismissed. "I am trying to help you. I am trying to do what Edmund would have wanted for you." Harriet considered this for a moment. Then she drove another peg into the wall. "Edmund left me a note," she said. "I'm doing what it says." Constance waited, clearly expecting more. When more did not come, she adjusted her own spectacles, and when that did not produce a response either, she gathered herself with the dignity of a woman who knows when a visit has concluded, even if the other party has not said so formally. "The Women's Auxiliary meets Thursday," she said again. "I hope you'll reconsider attending." She left with the stiff dignity of a woman who had been dismissed by someone who did not have the right to dismiss her, and the cold came in briefly through the door. She did not quite slam, and then the door settled back into its frame, and the room was quiet again except for the sound of Harriet's hammer. She thought about what Constance had said for exactly as long as it took to drive the next peg. Then she thought about Edmund's note instead, and that was better, and she kept working. She found Britta Solberg on a Wednesday. She had not planned to go to the general store that day. The sky looked threatening and her hip had been stiff since Monday, but she was out of lamp oil, and lamp oil was not something you could substitute or defer. She hitched the wagon herself, which took longer than it used to now that there was no one to hold the harness, while she worked the buckles, and she drove the 4 miles to town on roads that were more cold mud and a road, the horse patient and familiar under the gray sky. The town of Caldwell Crossing was not large enough to be called a town by most definitions, but it had a general store and a church and a post office that operated out of the back of the general store, and it had a bench outside the front door that caught the morning sun, when there was morning sun to catch, and on that bench on a Wednesday in October of 1884 sat Britta Solberg. She was small and ancient-seeming, with the compacted quality of someone who has been weathered by decades into something harder and more essential than what they started as. She seemed not to feel the cold the way other people felt it, which was remarkable for a morning that made Harriet's breath visible from 6 feet away. Her hair was white and braided and pinned close to her head in a way that spoke of another country, another century's understanding of how a woman arranged herself for the day. She was looking at nothing in particular with the calm attention of someone who had long since made peace with having nothing in particular to look at and found the arrangement satisfactory. People in Harlan County left Britta Solberg largely alone. She had been in the county longer than almost anyone 40 years past the creek, in a cabin everyone agreed was too old and too small and peculiarly arranged. But she had arrived foreign and stayed foreign, and she said things that people could not always follow, and she talked too much about Sweden, and in Harlan County, Minnesota in the fall of 1884, those were sufficient reasons to let a woman sit on her bench in peace and walk past. Harriet sat down next to her. She sat down because her hip was bothering her and the bench was there, and because she had Edmund's note in her pocket, and the note said, Britta Solberg, past the creek. The old woman looked at her sidelong with eyes that were still sharp and still blue, the eyes of someone who had been watching people for 7 decades and found them consistently more interesting than they found her. You're the vain woman, Britta said. Her accent was thick, but her meaning was clear. Each word placed with the deliberate care of someone who has constructed a second language, word by word over many years and respects the construction. Edmund's wife, I am Harriet said. Edmund's widow now. Britta nodded as though this was information she had already filed correctly and was simply confirming the filing. He was a good man, she said. Came to talk to me last winter. About the cold. I know, Harriet said. She took the folded note from her pocket and held it for a moment without opening it, feeling the soft edges of the paper that had been handled many times in the past weeks. He left me a note. He was going to try what you told him, before next winter. She said this last part quietly with the specific weight of words that mean more than they say. Britta looked at the note in Harriet's hand. She did not ask to read it. She seemed to understand precisely what it was, what kind of document it was, what it had cost the woman holding it to find it, what it meant that she had come here with it. But next winter came first, the old woman said. Yes, Harriet said. They sat for a moment with that. The wind moved across the street between the buildings carrying the smell of wood smoke from the church 2 blocks north. A wagon passed. The horse pulling it shook its head. Then Harriet said, I have half a wood pile, maybe 6 cords. I need to understand what you told him. Britta looked at her steadily with the full attention of someone taking a measure. You want to do this yourself? She said. Alone, I don't have another option, Harriet said. Not one I'm willing to take. The old woman was quiet for a moment. She looked at the road, at the bare trees at the far end of the street where the town gave way to open land, at something in the middle distance that may have been a memory. Then she folded her hands in her lap and spoke. In Sweden, she said, my mother's house was warm every winter. Not a big fire, not always enough wood, but warm. Because of the air. The air, Harriet repeated. Still air. Britta's voice had the quality of someone reciting something learned early on and well. Air that cannot move. My mother called it dead air. When air moves, it carries the heat with it, carries it away from you, carries it through the walls, gives it to the cold outside. This is what moving air does. It is a thief. But air that is trapped, air that has no room to circulate that air cannot steal the heat. It holds it. It becomes, you understand, a wall inside the wall. Harriet thought about the cabin, about the way the wind came through the log gaps on the north side when a front pushed down from Canada, not as a draft you could feel in one place, but as a general chill that rose from the walls themselves, as though the walls were generating cold rather than simply failing to stop it. About the mornings when she could see her breath inside the house before the stove got going, about the way the cold seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The quilts, she said slowly, hung away from the wall. Hang them away from the wall, Britta confirmed. 2 inches, not pressed against it, pressed against it, they just get cold themselves, conduct the chill right through. But 2 inches away with air trapped between the quilt and the logs, the air sits there and does nothing. And doing nothing is exactly what you need it to do. 2 inches, Harriet said. 2 inches. Britta held up 2 fingers, the gesture of someone who has made this measurement so many times that her hands remember it before her mind does. I have lived in my cabin 40 years with the walls hung. I use half the wood my neighbors use, sometimes less. They think I am strange. She paused with something that might have been amusement at the edges. I am strange, but I am also warm. Something settled in Harriet's chest. Not hope exactly. Hope was too light a word for what she was feeling, too provisional. It was more like recognition. The feeling of a problem that has had a shape you couldn't see clearly, and then suddenly you can see it, and the seeing of it makes the working of it possible. She spent another 20 minutes on that bench with Britta Solberg. She asked about the gap, how precise it needed to be, whether slightly more or less than 2 inches made a significant difference. She asked about which walls mattered most, whether the effort was worth making on all 4 walls, or whether there was diminishing return. She asked about the door and its drafts and whether sealing it helped, or whether that created other problems. She asked about the window on the south side and what you did about the glass, which was itself cold and could not be hung with a quilt and still admit light. Britta answered everything. She answered with the patience of a woman who has been sitting on a bench for 40 years, waiting for someone to ask, and who recognizes when the asking finally comes, that it deserves a thorough answer. She explained the door not sealed because you cannot seal a door and live behind it, but treated with strips of wool or heavy fabric pressed into the gaps. And then a second curtain hung 3 feet inside the door to create a dead air chamber between the entry and the main room. A person coming in from outside would bring cold with them as far as the curtain, and the curtain would stop it there, and the main room would hold its warmth. She explained the window, a panel that could be raised during daylight hours to let the winter sun through the glass and lowered at night to hold the heat. She drew the concept in the air with one finger, a diagram that Harriet followed and filed. Harriet asked the way a former schoolteacher asked, precisely in sequence, making sure she understood each element completely before moving to the next, not accepting the general principle until she could see the specific mechanism, not moving on until she was confident she could reproduce it herself in a coal barn with aching hands and no one to hold the other end. By the time she went inside for her lamp oil, she had a plan. Not just the outline of a plan, but the specific details of which quilts for which walls, in what order, using what materials she already had, and what she would need to acquire before the weather made acquiring things difficult. She had a plan the way a practical woman makes a plan, which is to say she had already begun solving the problems that would arise in the execution of it. She drove home through the mud roads with Edmund's note in her pocket and Britta's instructions in her head, and the first clean sense of direction she had felt since September, and she was almost back to the cabin when she saw the rider coming toward her on the road. He was one of the younger men from the settlement, Thomas Alcott, and he was riding with the particular purposeful urgency that meant he had been sent with a message rather than coming on his own business. He slowed his horse when he saw her wagon and pulled alongside, and he took his hat off before he spoke, which told her something about what he was about to say. "Mrs. Vane," he said, "I'm sorry to be the one to bring this to you." She waited. She had learned over 67 years that waiting was almost always the correct response to a sentence that began that way. "Mrs. Morrow has spoken to the Women's Auxiliary," he said. "They've made a decision about how to help with your situation. They're planning to hold a sale of household goods to raise funds for your—" He stopped. He looked at his hat brim. "For your resettlement" is the word they used. "They've set a date for the second Saturday of November." Mrs. Morrow said it was the Christian thing to do. She said you'd understand once you'd had time to consider. Harriet looked at him. "My resettlement," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He still did not meet her eyes. "I thought you should know before it was generally announced." Harriet was quiet. The wind moved across the field to her right, pressing the dry grass down in a long, slow wave and releasing it. The sky to the north had the color of old iron, the specific gray that meant the weather was working on something it intended to deliver within the week. "Thank you for telling me," she said. She kept her voice even, the way you keep your voice even When what you are feeling is something you have not yet finished processing and are not going to process on the side of a road in the company of someone else's discomfort. You can go on now, he went on. She drove the rest of the way in silence, the horse finding the familiar road without much guidance, and she sat on the wagon seat and felt the note in her pocket and thought about what the second Saturday of November meant. It was 18 days away. She unhitched the wagon and put the horse in and measured out the evening grain with her hands on autopilot, the routine of it occupying the surface of her attention while the rest of her worked through what needed to be worked through. She carried the lamp oil inside. She lit the stove, which had gone cold while she was in town. She set the kettle on. She sat at the table in the kitchen with the one hung quilt on the north wall, catching what was left of the evening light through the window, and she looked at the gap behind it, 2 inches of trapped air, dead air doing its patient, invisible work in the wall she had started. 1 wall, 3 to go, plus the door and the window. The second Saturday of November was 18 days away. She did not have 18 days to waste. She went to bed while it was still early, which was not her habit, and she lay in the dark room with the cold pressing against the window glass, and the one finished wall holding what it could against the north, and the other 3 walls still bare and drafting. She lay still and did the arithmetic again, not the wood arithmetic, she had done that enough, but the arithmetic of time. 3 days to finish the walls if she pushed herself and the joints cooperated. 2 more days for the door treatment and the window panel and the interior curtain. A week to be certain the system worked before she needed to stand in front of anyone and defend it. That left days to spare before the second Saturday of November. She thought about Edmund on that September morning, the axe in his hands, the steady rhythm of a man doing what needed to be done. She thought about the note in the toolbox about before next winter, written in his careful hand and tucked away for a future he had been expecting. She thought about Britta Solberg on the bench, 2 fingers held up 40 years of warmth that nobody had asked about until today. She thought about what it would mean to let the second Saturday of November arrive and find her without an answer. She was 67 years old. Her hands ached, and her back was older than she was, and she had half a woodpile in a cabin that leaked heat like a sieve, in a community that had already decided what her future looked like and was in the process of organizing the sale of her furniture to fund that future. She closed her eyes. She thought about dead air, about the invisible layer of stillness that held heat by the simple fact of its own stillness, that did its work not by fighting the cold but by understanding it, by finding the place where the cold entered, and putting something in its way that cold could not get through. About a woman in Sweden who had figured this out in some earlier century and passed it to her daughter, and her daughter had passed it forward across an ocean and 40 years of Minnesota winters until it ended up written in pencil on a folded piece of paper in a wooden toolbox, waiting for a next winter that Edmund did not live to see. The note had been waiting for her. Outside, the wind moved across Harlan County, cold and patient, and without particular malice, doing what cold does in the way that facts do what they do not, because they mean to, but because that is their nature. Harriet Vane lay still in the dark and let it try. Tomorrow she had walls to hang. She began on a Tuesday. It felt right that way. Edmund had left her on a Tuesday, and now she was starting something on a Tuesday. And maybe that symmetry meant nothing at all, or maybe it was exactly the kind of meaning that mattered when you were 67 years old and alone on a claim in Minnesota, and the only person who would have understood why you were treating a Tuesday like a significant occasion was the person whose Tuesday had made this one necessary. Harriet Vane was not a superstitious woman, but she was a woman who had lived long enough to know that practical women sometimes needed their Tuesdays to carry a little more than just a date. The north wall took most of the first morning. She worked the way she had always worked, methodically without rushing, checking each peg before trusting it with weight. Her hands had their own memory for this kind of labor, the grip and the swing and the reading of the wood grain, though the wood fought her more than it used to, and the hammer felt heavier by the 3rd hour than it had at the first. She stopped twice, once to rest her shoulder against the wall and let the joint settle, once to stand at the window and look at the sky, which was doing nothing threatening yet, but carried the look of a sky that had something in mind. Edmund's mother's quilt went on the north wall. She had not planned that specifically. She had planned to put the heavier of the 2 store-bought blankets on the north wall to save the family quilts for the side walls, where the cold was somewhat less determined. But when she held Edmund's mother's quilt in her hands that morning, The double wedding ring pattern, with its thick batting, its weight substantial and familiar, she understood that the north wall was where it belonged. The north wall was the one that faced the worst of it. The north wall was where you put the thing that could take the most punishment and give it back as warmth. That was what the north wall required, and Edmund's mother's quilt was the right answer to that requirement. She strung the rope between the pegs and hung it from the rope and stepped back. The 2-inch gap was there. She checked it with the notched stick moving along the wall in a crouch where the quilt hung lower, checking the measurement at the rope in the middle and the base. 2 inches at every point. The quilt hung plumb and straight, and in the 2-inch space between its back and the rough log wall, air was already beginning to do what Britta Solberg had described, beginning in its still and patient way to become a wall inside the wall. She could not feel it yet. The other 3 walls were still bare and the room was still cold. In the larger sense, still the kind of cold that comes through uncovered logs on a November morning. But at the north wall, if she stood close and held very still and paid attention, there was something different. Something that was not yet warmth, but was the absence of the particular draft that had come from that wall all autumn. By noon, she had finished the north wall. She ate standing at the counter, cold cornbread, and the last of the morning's coffee, and looked at what she had done, and let herself look at it plainly without qualification. It still looked strange. It looked like something a woman did when she had run out of better ideas, which was from one angle exactly what it was. She had run out of better ideas. This was the idea that remained. She intended to see it through without apology. The east wall was harder. The east wall had a nail she couldn't extract without damaging the surrounding wood, and a section of chinking between 2 of the lower logs that had crumbled away over the last dry summer. Leaving a gap, she could feel the outdoor temperature through with her bare hand. Not a draft exactly, but a general cold seeping through as though the outside were pressing its palm flat against the gap and leaning. She packed the gap with strips of wool she had cut from an old blanket, pressing the material in firmly with the handle of a screwdriver, working it into the space until it was solid. The chinking would hold the wool. The wool would slow whatever cold was getting through the gap itself. The quilt hung 2 inches from the wall would hold the dead air that would stop whatever the wool didn't catch. 3 layers of defense, each one doing its part. She was thinking like an engineer. She had not thought of herself as an engineer before this week. It was not an unpleasant realization. It was late in the afternoon of the first day, with the light thinning toward the particular gold of November late afternoon that always seemed to Harriet like the day's last attempt to seem warm, before admitting it was cold, that she noticed something she had not expected to notice so soon. She was standing in the middle of the room with her hands pressed against the base of her spine, which had been making its objections known since mid-morning, and was now insisting on a formal rest. She was standing still, not working, just standing and breathing, and letting her back tell her what it needed to tell her, and in that stillness, she noticed that she was not cold. Not warm, not what she would have called comfortable, not with 2 walls still bare, and the stove burning low from this morning's small fire. But the particular edge that had been in the air of the cabin since September. The edge that said the walls were losing the argument against the outside, that the cold was conducting itself through the logs and into the room like a tide that the stove was working against and barely holding. That edge was softer. Specifically softer on the north side of the room. She walked to the north wall and stood a foot away from the hanging quilt and held her hand out palm forward without touching the fabric. The air between her hand and the quilt was still. Completely still. No movement, no draft, no sense of cold working its way through, just air that had nowhere to go, and so was staying where it was, and in staying where it was doing the thing Britta Solberg had described on that bench. It was holding. Harriet stood there for a moment with her hand extended in the still air, feeling not warmth exactly, but the absence of cold, which in November in Harlan County amounted to nearly the same thing. Then she went back to work. The second day was harder than the first. She woke before dawn with her right hand stiff in a way that was more than the ordinary morning stiffness, her fingers curled toward her palm and reluctant to open. She lay in the dark and worked them slowly, patiently, the way she had learned to do over the past several winters, not forcing the joints, just encouraging them, giving the warmth of her own body time to work on the stiffness, and the stiffness as time to concede. It took longer than it had the day before. Longer than she was prepared to acknowledge to anyone, including herself. Her back had filed its overnight report, and the report was not favorable. She was 67 years old. She knew this fact the way you know a fact that has been true for long enough to lose its novelty, and then some mornings it became specific, again became present, in particular, and unwilling to be absorbed into the general background of ongoing life. This was one of those mornings. Her body was 67 years old, and the work was not 67-year-old work, and the gap between those two things was something she would have to work with rather than push through. She made coffee. She sat down to drink it, which she did not always allow herself when there was work to do, because sitting down in the morning before work was started had always seemed to her like a kind of negotiation she was not willing to open. But today she sat down. She drank the coffee, sitting at the table with the light coming up outside the east window, and looked at the two finished walls and the two bare ones. Then she picked up the hammer. She drove the first peg of the second day at 6:30 in the morning, with the stove barely warm and her breath still visible, and the light outside the color of pewter. She drove it the way you drive something when you have decided not to have the conversation with yourself about whether you just bring the hammer down and the peg goes in and you move to the next one and you let the work carry you, rather than waiting for a feeling of readiness that may or may not arrive. The west wall took most of the morning. The south wall with its window required more thinking. She had planned the south wall solution while lying in the dark the night before in the window, between finishing with the joints and falling back to sleep. A quilt on a simple rod that could be raised and lowered on a pair of ropes raised in the mornings to let the winter sun come through the glass lowered at night to hold the heat that the south wall was otherwise losing through the cold glass. It was not complicated in concept. It required care and execution. She rigged the ropes to cleats she mounted above the window frame, and she tested the raising and lowering 3 times before she was satisfied that it would hold the quilt at the right height without sagging into the glass. It took her 2 hours. She had to redo one section when the rope slipped its cleat and the quilt dropped at an angle. Edmund would have built something more elegant for this purpose, something with a proper mechanism rather than a pair of ropes and 2 cleats. What she built worked, and working was what she needed. By the time the south wall was finished, the light outside was failing. She lit the lamp and stood in the center of the cabin and looked at what she had made. Every wall was hung, the north wall with Edmund's mother's quilt thick and heavy and plumb, the east wall with its wool-patched gap and its medium weight covering. The west wall whose quilt had been her and Edmund's, bought in Duluth the summer they made the trip, a rare extravagance that she had never regretted. The south wall with its raisable panel now lowered against the evening cold, the window dark behind it. The door had wool strips pressed into every seam where drafts had come through for years, and a heavy wool curtain hung 3 feet inside it on a rod. Cold air that got past the door would meet the curtain and stop unable to reach the main room. The dead air chamber between door and curtain would hold whatever cold had made it that far. The room looked nothing like any room she had lived in. It looked like a room that had been assembled by someone with a specific and urgent purpose, with no attention paid to the usual considerations of how a room ought to look. The walls were fabric instead of logs. The corners were soft. The whole space had a strange enclosed quality, like being inside something rather than simply being surrounded by walls. If Constance Morrow could see it now, the word she would use would be peculiar, and she would not be wrong by the usual standards. But Harriet was not operating by the usual standards this winter. She lit the stove. She used less wood than she would have used yesterday before the walls were hung. That was deliberate. She was testing the system, not just heating the room. She wanted to know what the hung walls could hold on a modest fire, not an extravagant one. She sat in her chair and she read and she waited, watching the temperature of the room the way you watch something you want to understand rather than something you want to fix. An hour passed. The room was warm, not just not cold, warm. The kind of warm that let her take the shawl from her shoulders and set it on the back of the chair without immediately wanting it back. The kind of warm that meant the stove was winning the argument it had been losing all autumn because the walls had stopped sending all the heat out into the prairie and had started keeping it where it was generated. She sat in that warmth and tried to stay practical about it. She could not quite manage purely practical, because this was the warmth Edmund had wanted her to have. He had found Britta Solberg and written the note and tucked it in the toolbox and meant to do exactly this before next winter. And now she was sitting in the warmth that he had planned for her and found the solution to and written down for her to find, and he was not here to sit in it with her. She was warm and she was alone, and both of those things were true at exactly the same time, and there was no way to hold both of them that did not hurt somewhere. She did not cry. She had cried in the first weeks after September, and she had found that crying while honest did not resolve anything about the arithmetic, and she was a practical woman who understood that arithmetic did not resolve itself while you were crying. But she sat in that warmth for a long time and let it be exactly what it was, Edmund's gift delivered late, and no less a gift for that. She went to bed with the fire banked low, in the expectation of waking to a cold room as she had every morning since September. She woke at first light to a room that was still warm. The coals had held through the night. The dead air had held the heat. The trapped stillness between the quilts and the wings had done its work through all the hours she had been unconscious, without tending, without feeding, without anyone in the room at all. Just physics doing what physics does when you arrange the conditions correctly. Harriet got up and made coffee and stood at the south window with the quilt raised and the morning light coming through the glass and looked at her woodpile. She had not touched the woodpile in 2 days. She had used only the small stack of split wood she kept inside by the stove. The cords outside were exactly as she had left them. She drank her coffee and let herself feel something that was not quite certainty, but was close enough to certainty to be useful. The word spread the way words spread in a settlement of 300 souls, with long winters and not quite enough to occupy the mind between the last harvest and the first thaw. By the first week of December, everyone in Harlan County knew that Harriet Vane had covered her walls with quilts. The telling of it ranged from curious to dismissive to openly mocking, depending on who was telling it and to whom, but the core fact was accurate. She had done it, she was still there, and the smoke from her chimney was thinner than it had any right to be. Constance Morrow made sure the conversation was well supplied. At the Thursday church meeting at the general store door at the well, where women gathered to exchange the information that kept a settlement running at every gathering, where voices collected, Constance's voice was among them, and it carried its assessment with the authority of a woman who had been the most certain person in every room for 30 years. She is living in a fabric store, Constance said to anyone who would hear it. I went to see her last month and she had quilts on every wall. Edmund's mother's work, her own marriage quilt, hanging on the wall like laundry on a rope, and she barely has a fire going. A woman in grief does strange things, and the compassionate response is not to stand by and observe. She said this with the weight of someone who had compassion carefully organized and was prepared to deploy it. And the wood people asked, "She is not burning enough to keep a cat warm in November," Constance said, "which means either the cold hasn't found her yet, or she will not last February. I have told the auxiliary that we should be prepared." She said this last part with the particular solemnity of a woman who has made a prediction and intends to be present to receive the confirmation. There was a man in the back of the store on one of those December afternoons who heard this and did not join it. His name was Thomas Alcott, not the young rider who had brought the message about the furniture sale, but an older man who happened to carry the same name, a coincidence common in settlements where names circulated among families and came around again in the next generation. This Thomas Alcott was 58 years old, a widower of 3 years, a farmer of deliberate habits and careful observations, and very few unnecessary words. He had come into the store for seed catalogs and found himself standing at the back of the dry goods aisle listening to Constance Morrow explain why a widow's thin chimney smoke was evidence of poor judgment. He had passed Harriet Vane's cabin on his way into town. He had seen the chimney smoke. He had noticed it because it was his habit to notice things, and because the smoke was thinner than it should have been for the temperature outside, and because a thin chimney smoke in a cold November either meant the fire had gone out or meant something else, something he did not have a word for yet, but that his farmer's attention to cause and effect would not let him dismiss as nothing. He bought his seed catalogs and drove home and looked at his own walls, which were log and nothing else, and thought about what the past 3 winters had cost him in wood. He thought about it the way a farmer thinks about a cost he has always paid without examining, and then begins to wonder whether the paying of it was inevitable or whether it was simply what you did when you did not know there was another way. He did not speak to anyone about this. He was not a man who spoke about his thinking before the thinking was finished. But he thought about it carefully through December, and the thinking did not resolve itself into nothing. December passed. Harriet's woodpile barely moved. She went to town twice that month, once for supplies and once because the lamp oil ran low again, and both times she sat on the bench outside the general store in case Britta Solberg was there. The second time she was. The old woman was sitting in her usual position with her usual expression of someone who has found a comfortable accommodation with having nothing in particular to do and nowhere in particular to be. They sat together in the thin December sun, and Harriet told her the walls were working. Britta nodded as though this was information she had always possessed, which she had. She asked about the door treatment, and Harriet described the wool strips in the interior curtain in detail, and Britta nodded again and said that was right. That was the important part, not sealing the door, but creating the secondary barrier, the dead air chamber between the entry and the room, so that cold air had somewhere to stop short of where you were living. Like an airlock, Harriet said. Britta looked at her with those sharp blue eyes. Yes, she said. Like that. They were quiet for a moment, sitting together in the thin, cold sun. How much wood have you used? Britta asked. About a cord and a half, Harriet said. Maybe a little less. Britta nodded. And your neighbors? Harriet thought about the Mercer family whose stovepipe she could see from her south window, smoking heavily from first light every morning. She thought about the church which Reverend Morrow kept heated as though God required a certain temperature to be present. She thought about the Alcott farm whose chimney she passed every time she went to town, putting up the thick gray smoke of a stove, working very hard. More, she said. Much more, Britta said without satisfaction. She pulled her coat a little tighter, though she did not look particularly cold. In Sweden, she said, we understood winter differently. We did not fight it. We found where it entered, and we stopped it there. The fight is very small if you know where to stand. Harriet thought about this on the drive home. You find where it enters, and you stop it there. She thought about Constance Morrow's certainty, and about the women's auxiliary, and about the furniture sale that had never happened, because she had spent that second Saturday of November driving pegs into log walls, and by the time anyone thought to push the plan forward, the moment had simply passed. The whistle of moments pass when the person they were aimed at refuses to be in the expected position when they arrive. She had not attended the women's auxiliary meeting that Thursday. She had not sent a message. She had simply not appeared, which was, she felt, a complete, insufficient answer to the invitation. January came the way January came to Harlan County. Not gradually, not diplomatically, but all at once, as though it had been waiting just past the county line with its full equipment and had finally decided to deploy it. The temperature dropped in the first week and kept dropping. The sky went the white of old bone. The snow that fell in the second week was not the tentative, early snow of November, but the authoritative snow, the kind that meant to stay that packed hard in the wind and lay in drifts against the north side of every structure in the county. The night of the 14th of January, the thermometer outside the kitchen window read 18 degrees below zero. Harriet banked the stove carefully that night, methodically, with the dense hardwood pieces that burned long and slow. She checked the door seams and found one corner of the wool strip that had worked partly loose, and she pressed it back into the gap and held it a moment to make sure it seated. She checked the interior curtain. She lowered the south wall panel. She went to bed. She slept. At 4 in the morning, she woke not because she was cold, but because the wind had found a deeper register in its crossing of the open ground. A lower sound sustained the sound of wind that has abandoned any pretense of being anything other than what it is. She lay still and listened to it. She paid attention to the temperature of the room, the way you pay attention when you are testing rather than simply experiencing. The room was warm. She got up and put 2 pieces of wood on the coals, 2 pieces the first time she had added wood in the middle of the night all winter, and went back to bed and slept again until the light came. It was the morning of January 15th, with the temperature still well below zero outside, and the sky the particular white that meant it intended to stay that way, that she heard the knock. 3 deliberate raps, the knock of someone who knew what they wanted. She opened the door to Constance Morrow. This was not the Constance of October, the one who had walked in without knocking, with her certainty arranged about her like a well-fitted coat. This Constance was wrapped in so many layers she seemed somehow reduced by them, her face red at the edges from the walk from where she had tied her horse, her breath coming in heavy white clouds that disappeared quickly into the cold. She looked like a woman who had made a decision that made her uncomfortable and had come to act on it before the discomfort could mount a successful argument for delay. I was passing, she said. No one passed Harriet's cabin on the way to anywhere. Harriet let this stand. "Come in," she said. The warmth reached Constance in the doorway. Harriet watched it register the small physical adjustment, the slight widening of the eyes, the recalibration that happens when a body encounters something different from what it was prepared for. You could see in that moment the point at which a person's body understood something that their mind was still engaged in arguing about. Constance stepped inside. She stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, looking at each wall in sequence. At Edmund's mother's quilt on the north wall, at the marriage quilt on the west wall, at the interior curtain by the door, at the stove which was burning with the easy, unhurried quality of a fire that is not being asked to fight a losing battle, at the wood pile visible through the south window, the cords that should have been significantly reduced by the 15th of January and were not. She was quiet for a long moment. "How are you managing?" she said finally. Her voice was different from October. The certainty was present, but quieter, turned inward, working on something rather than reporting a conclusion already reached. "Very well," Harriet said. "Better than I expected. The room is warm." "It is. You've barely got a fire going." Harriet said nothing to this. She went to the kitchen and poured coffee into 2 cups and brought them back and handed one to Constance, who took it with both hands and held it the way people hold something warm when they have just come in from genuine cold. They stood in the warm room and drank. Constance turned slowly in place, looking at each wall again, with the careful attention of someone conducting an inventory rather than a visit. She looked at the gap between the quilts and the longs visible at the edges, where the fabric didn't quite reach the corner. 2 inches, consistent around the room. "How much wood have you burned?" she asked. Her voice had gone very quiet. "A little over 2 cords," Harriet said. "Maybe 2.5. Constance was still. 2.5 cords, she said. "Yes, it is January 15th. "I know what day it is," Harriet said. Constance set her coffee cup down on the table with a deliberate, careful movement, the movement of someone managing something they do not want to spill. She looked out the window at the woodpile for a moment. "We have burned 8 cords," she said. "At the house, the Reverend has burned nearly that much at the church alone. We keep 2 stoves going from first light to last, and the rooms are still cold in the evenings." Harriet did not say what she was thinking. She was thinking it clearly, but she did not say it because saying it would have made the moment smaller, and this moment had a natural size that deserved to be respected. Constance looked at the north wall, at Edmund's mother's quilt hanging straight and still with its 2-inch gap of trapped air doing its invisible work behind it. She looked at it for a long time, the way you look at something when you are revising a substantial opinion. She picked up her coffee cup. "How does it work?" she said. And Harriet Vane, who had been a school teacher for 8 years and had spent 31 winters on the Minnesota plains and had buried a child and a husband and had half a wood pile in a community that had organized a sale of her furniture, sat down across the table from the woman who had spent the autumn trying to determine her future and began to explain. "Still air," she said, "air that cannot move. You trap it between the quilt and the wall, 2 inches, no more, no less, and because it cannot circulate, it cannot carry the heat away. The cold from the logs hits the dead air and stops. The warmth stays in the room instead of bleeding through the walls out into the prairie." Constance listened. She did not interrupt. She did not adjust her spectacles in the manner that preceded disapproval. She sat with her hands around her coffee cup, and she listened, and Harriet could see something working in her face, some long-running internal argument, arriving at the point where one side had accumulated enough evidence to close the case. Harriet explained the door treatment. She explained the interior curtain and the airlock principle. She explained why pressing the fabric against the wall didn't work, why the gap was the mechanism, why still air and moving air behaved differently in the physics of heat loss. She explained it the way she had taught reading: start with the principle, build to the specific check for understanding, do not move on until you are sure the foundation is solid. Constance asked questions. They were good questions, the questions of a woman who has been running an organization for 20 years and has learned to go directly to the load-bearing elements. She asked about the thickness of batting. She asked about wool versus cotton. She asked about corner gaps, about what happened at the floor where the quilt couldn't hang all the way to the boards. Harriet answered everything. Outside, the January cold pressed against the quilted walls of the cabin and found, as it had been finding since November, A layer of stillness it could not penetrate. Inside the stove burned low and the coffee stayed warm, and the room held its temperature with the patient ease of a system that has been working correctly for 2 months and has no intention of stopping. By the time Constance put on her layers to leave, the morning was half gone. She stood at the door with the interior curtain pushed aside, and she looked back at the room one final time. Harriet had seen that look before, not on Constance, but on students. The look of someone at the moment when something has moved from the category of information to the category of understanding. She did not apologize. Harriet had not expected her to. But she stood at the door for a moment with something in her face that was not the certainty that had always been there. And in its absence was something harder to name, the expression of a woman who has been very sure about something for a very long time and has just spent a morning standing inside the evidence that she was wrong. Then she put her head down against the wind and walked to her horse. Harriet closed the door. She straightened the interior curtain. She put one small piece of wood on the fire, just one, because one was what the room needed, and sat back down at her table. 2.5 cords. 8 weeks into the hardest winter in a decade, and 2.5 cords. She took Edmund's note from the pocket of her dress and unfolded it and read it, though she had memorized it weeks ago. Look into this before next winter. She folded it back along its worn creases. She put it in her pocket. She picked up her book. The room was warm. February came in quietly. That was the thing about February in Harlan County that people who had not lived through a Minnesota winter did not understand. They expected the worst month to announce itself, to arrive with the blunt violence of January, the below-zero nights, and the bone-white sky, and the wind that had crossed 1,000 miles of open ground without finding anything worth pausing for. Instead, February came in soft. The temperature lifted by 2 degrees, then 3. The sky shifted from the white of old bone to a pale gray that suggested, without quite promising the possibility of blue somewhere behind it. The snow stopped falling new and simply sat where it was, packed, hard and patient-looking, and the cold settled into something quieter and more determined than anything January had managed. People who had survived many Minnesota winters recognized this. February's quiet was not mercy, it was resolution. January fought openly, announced itself, gave you something specific to brace against. February simply waited, and waiting was the harder thing to defend against, because you could not see it coming, and you could not see when it was done, and in the space between those two invisible points, it did more accumulated damage than all of January's announced assault. Harriet Vane had lived through 32 of them. She knew exactly what February was and what it was capable of. She also knew on the first morning of that month that she had 4 cords of wood remaining. She stood at the south window with her morning coffee and looked at the wood pile in the gray early light, counting what remained against what the month would ask for, doing the arithmetic one more time, as she had done it every few days since November. For the first time since September, the numbers worked. Not barely, not with optimistic assumptions and careful management. They worked with room to spare, enough wood to carry her through February and well into March, with something left over, a margin she had not had since Edmund died, a buffer between her situation and the edge. She drank her coffee and felt the particular satisfaction of arithmetic that comes out right. Constance Morrow had not been back since January. Harriet had not expected her to return quickly. What she had not expected were the other visitors, the ones who began appearing in the second week of February, not with Constance's agenda or authority, but with a different quality of attention. The attention of people who had heard a specific number and could not stop thinking about it. The number was 2.5 cords. The number Constance had carried back to town from the January visit and set against the number 9, which was her own consumption, and the number 11, which was the church. Those numbers had been traveling through Harlan County all through January, moving from person to person, the way specific numbers move when they are striking enough to repeat without elaboration. The first visitor was Nora Patton. Nora's husband farmed the land to the east, and Nora had 3 children under 10, and she had told Harriet once at a church social 2 summers past that her cabin in January was so cold that the children slept in their coats. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon with a jar of preserved plums and the expression of a woman trying to appear as though she had simply been passing by, which was no more convincing than it had been when Constance used it, since Nora lived half a mile in the other direction and had clearly driven out of her way. She sat at Harriet's table and looked at the walls, and asked in the careful tone of someone trying not to sound desperate whether Harriet might explain what she had done. Harriet explained. She used the same patient sequential method she had used in 8 years of teaching children. Start with the principle, so the specific steps make sense when they arrive. Build from simple to complex, check for understanding at each stage before moving on. She explained dead air in the 2-inch gap, in the choice of walls by exposure, in the door treatment, in the interior curtain. She answered every question Nora asked, and two she had not thought to ask yet. Nora left with the preserved plums forgotten on the table, left behind in the concentration of listening and the urgency of leaving to begin work on what she had just heard. The second visitor was Gerald Foss. Gerald farmed west of town and came on no pretense of neighborly concern. He came directly hat in hand and said he had heard she was burning less than half the wood anyone else was using, and he needed to know how. He was not a man who dressed up a practical question in social courtesy, and Harriet respected this. She told him. He asked whether the principle would work on a larger cabin, and she said she believed so the mechanism was the same regardless of the square footage, though more space required more material and more attention to ensure the gaps were consistent around the whole perimeter. He nodded and thanked her and left, and she watched him go and thought of Britta Sober on that bench, 40 years of answers, ready for questions that had not come. She understood that patience now in a way she had not understood it in October. The third visitor came in March after the worst of the winter had conceded its case. Thomas Alcott came not with questions, but with conclusions. He had spent the winter thinking she could see this in the way he arrived, the direct, purposeful manner of a man who has finished working something out and has come to confirm a specific detail rather than to begin a conversation. He had measured his walls, he said. He had counted his wood from last winter. He wanted to know whether wool held the dead air better than cotton for a cabin with a north-facing main room. Harriet told him wool was better for the north cotton, adequate for east and west wool, again for any wall with a persistent moisture problem, because it handled the cold side condensation more forgivingly. He nodded, wrote 2 words in a small notebook he kept in his coat pocket, thanked her, and left. She watched his wagon down the road and thought by April his walls will be hung, and by next winter his chimney smoke will be the thinnest in the county, and people will come to ask him why, and he will tell them what she told him, which was what Britta told her, which was what Britta's mother taught in Sweden in a century now past. She thought the chain does not depend on any one link being celebrated. It depends on each link holding. Constance Morrow arrived on a Saturday morning in late February. Harriet heard the knock, 3 deliberate raps, same as January, same as before, and she knew from the interval between the second and third rap, a hesitation so small, it was barely a hesitation that this was a different kind of visit from any Constance had made before. She opened the door. Constance was dressed for the cold, but not as heavily as February's quieter temperature, not requiring January's full armor. She looked more like herself than she had in January, the certainty back in her posture in the set of her shoulders, but it was arranged differently than it had been in the fall. It sat on her now the way certainty sits on someone who has recently been required to earn it back, rather than simply possessing it as a birthright. I have a question, Constance said. Come in, Harriet said. Constance came in and sat at the table without waiting to be invited, which was more like her usual manner, and she put her hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment before she spoke. How much wood have you burned this winter? She said. Total, all the way through. Harriet considered. 4 cords, she said. A little over, maybe. Constance nodded once slowly. We have burned 9, she said. At the house, the Reverend has burned 11 at the church. She said these numbers in the flat tone of someone making an accounting, not a complaint, just stating what the record showed, the way a careful person presents figures that speak for themselves. You have 4 cords remaining. About that. February isn't over. No, but I'll have wood left at the end of it, possibly for March as well. Constance was quiet for a moment. The stove burned with its low, unhurried sound. Outside, a crow made its commentary on the February morning and moved on. I told the Women's Auxiliary in October that you would be out of wood by Christmas, Constance said. I told them again in December that you would be in serious difficulty by February. Harriet said nothing. I was wrong, Constance said. The words were simple and specific. Harriet understood that they had cost something. understood the weight of them coming from a woman who had spent 65 years being the most certain person in every room she entered. She did not diminish them by offering a smaller version of what they were, and she did not amplify them with performance. You were working with what you knew, she said. Constance looked at her directly. That is more generous than I deserve. Perhaps. But it's accurate. A pause between them. The kind of pause that is not empty but full of the particular history of two women who have been on opposite sides of something for 5 months and are now carefully not being on opposite sides of it. I want to know how to do it, Constance said. The walls, the door, all of it. Not the general idea, the specific execution. I want to understand it well enough to do it myself and then explain it to anyone who asks. Harriet looked at this woman who had walked into her cabin uninvited in October with a list of men she might marry and a plan to sell her furniture. Who had told the settlement she would freeze? Who had arrived at the second week of February with 4 cords of wood still in the yard and the question of what happened next requiring a new answer? She thought about Britta Solberg, about 40 years of answers waiting in a warm cabin past the creek, about knowledge that had sat patient and complete through 4 decades of neighbors burning through their wood, while the answers were available half a mile away if anyone had thought to ask. She thought about Edmund's note, about the chain that had run from a woman in Sweden to her daughter, to Britta, to Edmund's piece of paper to Harriet's pocket, and was now sitting across the table from the most influential woman in Harlan County who was finally ready to learn. Some things traveled a long way to arrive at the right moment. All right, Harriet said, let me show you. She spent 2 hours with Constance that morning. She began with the principle still air, dead air, the behavior of heat in the presence of moving air versus trapped air. And she watched Constance's face as the understanding moved in the same recognition Harriet had felt on that bench in October, the feeling of a mechanism becoming visible. Constance asked good questions. She asked about thickness of batting, about the difference between wool and cotton in practice, about whether corner gaps compromised the system, about what happened at the floor, where the quilt couldn't hang through to the boards. She asked with the focused precision of a woman who runs an organization and has learned to identify the points where a plan can fail and ask about those points before committing. Harriet answered everything. She answered the way she had taught, completely patiently, with examples where examples helped. By the time Constance stood to leave, the morning was gone. The pale February sun had come through the south window, which Harriet had raised the panel for as she always did when the light permitted. Constance stood at the door in the familiar position, layers going back on hand, on the curtain, and she paused in the way she had paused in January, but this time she did not leave the pause empty. I owe you more than I can easily say, she said. Her voice was not diminished. It was the same substantial voice that had run the Women's Auxiliary for 20 years, but aimed differently, aimed inward rather than outward. I behaved with a certainty I had not earned. About your capabilities, about what you needed, about what your life should look like going forward. Harriet waited. I'm sorry for that, Constance said. Then, without waiting for a response, which Harriet recognized as its own kind of consideration, since waiting for a response would have made the apology about the response rather than about the thing being apologized for, she went out into the February cold and walked to her horse. Harriet stood at the door for a moment. Then she closed it and straightened the curtain and went to put the kettle on, and she stood at the kitchen window while the water heated and watched Constance Morrow's horse carry her back toward town through the white February landscape. And she thought about the arithmetic of the thing, 4 chords used, 9 chords used, 11 chords used, and about what those numbers meant when they were laid next to each other without commentary. The numbers were sufficient. The numbers were the whole argument, stated without requiring anything from either side. She visited Britta Solberg the following week. February had softened enough by then to make the road to the creek passable without difficulty, and Harriet drove the 4 miles in the late morning when the light was best and strongest. She found Britta in her cabin, which was smaller than Harriet's and more worn, and utterly, completely warm, the warmth of a place that has been properly insulated for 40 years, a settled warmth that was part of the structure itself, as though the warmth had become a building material over 4 decades. The walls were hung, had been hung since Britta's second winter in Harlan County. Harriet stood in the doorway and looked at them with the understanding she had not had the first time she had come here, understanding now what she was seeing, understanding the mechanism that the worn quilts and faded blankets represented, the physics they embodied, the 40 years of warmth they proved. The fabric was old. The batting had compressed over decades. But the 2-inch gap was there at every wall, and the door had its wool seams, and the warmth was real and present in exactly what Britta had described on that bench in October. 40 years, Harriet said. Britta was sitting close to her small stove, which was burning at a level that in any uninsulated cabin would have been laughably inadequate for February. She looked up when Harriet came in and smiled. 42, she said, since my second winter here. I got it wrong the first winter. She said this without self-criticism as a simple fact of how learning works. I did not have enough fabric, and I pressed it against the wall, and it just got cold itself. The second winter, I did it right. Harriet sat in the chair across from her. She asked the question she had been carrying since October. Why didn't you tell people, she said, all those years, all those neighbors burning through their wood season after season? Why didn't you knock on their doors and show them? Britta looked at her with those sharp blue eyes, still clear, at 79, still carrying the quality of someone who finds the world consistently interesting and has not run out of observations about it. I told people, she said, in the beginning, several times in the first years. She paused. They did not want to be told things by a Swedish woman with a foreign accent who lived past the creek in a peculiar little cabin and talked too much about where she came from. Harriet thought about this. And then you stopped, she said. Britta shook her head slightly, not stopped, waited. She looked at Harriet steadily. Most people walk past. You sat down. Because my hip hurt, Harriet said. Britta smiled again. Perhaps. But you sat down, and you had Edmund's note, and you asked the right questions in the right order. She folded her hands in her lap with the calm of someone who has long since made peace with the way things move in the world. Knowledge does not disappear because no one listens to it. It waits. It lives in the places where it has been put, and it waits for the person who will sit down and ask. Harriet stayed through the afternoon. She helped with tasks that had been accumulating, the kind of tasks that Britta's 80-year-old hands managed less easily now than they had managed 10 years ago, the kind of tasks that Harriet's 67-year-old hands were still equal to if she was patient with herself. They worked together without needing to coordinate it, falling into the easy division of effort that comes between people who understand each other's capabilities without having to discuss them. Britta talked about Sweden while they worked, not as longing, not as homesickness, but as a reference point. A place whose winters had been the laboratory where truths were worked out that remained true everywhere winters occurred. She talked about her mother who had hung the walls in Uppsala, about her mother's mother who had taught it to her mother, about the chain of women, each one ensuring the next generation would be warm, each one passing the specific knowledge forward with the specific measurements attached 2 inches, not 1, not 3, 2, because the measurements mattered and the principle alone was not sufficient. A chain that crossed an ocean, Harriet said. Britta nodded. And 40 years of a county that did not ask, she said. But now you will teach them. I've already started, Harriet said. And then she told Britta about Nora Patton and Gerald Foss and Thomas Alcott and the specific questions they had asked and the answers she had given, and Britta listened with the attention of someone receiving a report on work they care about. Good, Britta said. She was quiet for a moment. Do not let them forget where it came from. Not from you, not from Edmund's note. From here. She touched her own chest. From Sweden. From my mother. I won't, Harriet said. She meant it without reservation. The spring that followed was the kind of spring that explains why people stayed in Minnesota despite everything winter said against the idea. It came tentatively, then with increasing conviction, then all at once the way the best decisions arrive. The snow retreated from the south-facing ground first, then from the fields, then from the north-facing slopes where it held on longest, as though making a point. The cottonwoods along the creek put out their first small leaves, and then in what felt like a single week were fully dressed. Harriet began her garden in April. She worked the ground herself with the tools Edmund had kept sharp, and in order turning the soil in the methodical rows he had established in their first spring on the claim. Her back made its objections known. She worked anyway, not from stubbornness, but from the understanding that the garden was part of proving up the claim, and the claim was the center of the whole project, and the project was not finished. Nora Patton came in April, and then they hung Nora's walls together over 2 days, Harriet guiding and Nora working. And when they were finished, Nora stood in the center of her cabin and looked at the hung walls with the expression of someone who has just given their family a significant gift and is still absorbing the fact of having been able to do it. Gerald Foss came in May with 3 neighbors, and Harriet stood in his yard and explained the principle to 4 men who listened with the concentrated attention of farmers, calculating whether a thing was worth its cost. 2 of them hung their walls before the first snow of the following autumn. The other 2 waited until January, which was harder but not impossible, and joined the knowledge then. Thomas Alcott hung his walls in April, as she had expected he would. He did it alone methodically over 4 days, and by May, his cabin was ready for the following winter. He did not make a production of it. He simply did the work, and then when people noticed the following winter that his chimney smoke was the thinnest in the county, he told them what he had done and where he had learned it and whose knowledge it ultimately was. He was that kind of man. Constance Morrow hung her walls in June. She came to Harriet beforehand, and they went to the Morrow house together, and Harriet walked through the rooms and pointed out the north exposure and the door gaps, and the window placement, in the corners, where cold was most likely to find its way in. They spent a full day on the work. The minister's wife was a capable woman. She had always been that. The capability had never been what was in question, and once she understood what she was doing, she worked efficiently and with the precision of someone taking a new skill seriously. When they were done, Constance stood in her front room and looked at the hung walls and was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The Reverend is going to ask me what I've done to his parlor." "Tell him you've cut the wood bill by half," Harriet said. "He'll want to know who taught you." "Tell him the truth," Harriet said. Constance looked at her. "The truth is that I should have listened in October," she said. "The truth is also that you're teaching it now," Harriet said. "Both things are true at the same time." Constance was quiet for a moment, looking at the wall with her hands loose at her sides. "Then I want to speak to the Women's Auxiliary about this, formally at a proper meeting. I want every family in this settlement to know how to do it before next winter." Harriet thought about Britta Solberg, about 42 years of waiting, about a warm cabin that the county had ridden past for 4 decades. "I think Britta Solberg should be there," Harriet said. "When you speak to them, she's the one who should be answering the questions." Constance nodded once. "I'll send a wagon for her," she said. Harriet looked at the minister's wife, who was bending to check the gap on one of the lower wall hangings, checking it with the instinctive attention of someone who has just learned something and is already integrating it, already making it her own. "Thank you," Harriet said. Constance did not look up from the wall. "The least I can do," she said, and the way she said it made clear that she understood precisely how much that was, and that she was aware it did not fully close the account. Britta Solberg came to the Women's Auxiliary meeting in June. She came in Constance Morrow's wagon, the finest wagon in Harlan County, a fact that was not lost on the people who saw it pass on the road to the creek. And she sat in Constance's parlor, which had been hung the week before, the dead air already doing its work in the newly insulated walls, and she answered questions for 2 hours. She drew diagrams in the air with her hands, and then on paper when someone thought to bring paper. She talked about Sweden without apology. She explained still air and dead air and the physics of heat loss in the careful accented English she had been building word by word for 40 years, and when the English failed her, she used her hands, and the women around her filled in the words because they were paying the kind of attention that closes the gap between what is said and what is meant. Harriet sat to her left and said very little. She did not need to say much. The knowledge was Britta's. The room was full. The women were listening. That was the thing Harriet had promised on that February afternoon in the warm cabin by the creek, the thing she had been carrying since she first sat down on a bench in October because her hip hurt and a bench was there. By the autumn of 1885, 6 families in Harlan County had hung their walls. By the autumn of 1886, 14. By the winter of 1887, 3 years after Harriet had driven the first peg into her north wall on a Tuesday in November, more than half the settlement was using dead air insulation. The price of heavy fabric at the general store had risen twice in 2 years as demand increased. The storekeeper had begun ordering heavier wool specifically and had written to a supplier in St. Paul to explain why the order had grown so substantially, and the supplier had written back that he could not account for why a single settlement in Harlan County was consuming quilting cotton at the rate of a much larger town. People called the technique by different names. Some called it the quilt method. Some called it dead air spacing. Some simply called it what you did to your walls before winter, the way you salted pork and put up the root vegetables and laid in the cordwood, something so absorbed into the practice of the place that it had stopped needing a name. Harriet noticed this happening and said nothing about it in public. In private, when people came to learn, she always said the same thing at the start. This knowledge came from Britta Solberg, who brought it from Sweden, who learned it from her mother. You are part of a chain. Pass it forward with the name attached. Most people did. Britta's health declined in the spring of 1886 in the gradual way that health declines in a woman of 80 who has done a great deal of living. Not suddenly, not with crisis, just the slow narrowing that happens when a body has used most of what it was given and is moving toward the end of the inventory. She noted this with the same steady attention she gave to everything, the attention of someone for whom facts were facts, regardless of how inconvenient it would be to ignore them. Harriet visited twice a week through March and April, driving the creek road in whatever weather the spring offered. She brought food and company, and sometimes only presents sitting in the warm cabin, while Britta rested, keeping the small fire at the low, steady level that was all the well-insulated cabin ever needed. On an afternoon in early May, with the cottonwoods along the creek in full first leaf and the water running clear with snowmelt, Britta was very quiet, and Harriet sat close and held her hand. The old woman's hands were extraordinary in their way. 80 years of work had made them precise and economical, like tools refined by long use to exactly the form required. Harriet held one of them and thought about what it had done, the pegs it had driven, the ropes it had strung, the walls it had hung across 4 decades, the bread it had made in a small cabin past the creek, while the county around it struggled through winters that her cabin understood and theirs did not. You did well, Britta said. Her voice was thin, but it was clear. You did the hard part, Harriet said. The hard part was 40 years of waiting, Britta said. You did not have to wait. You sat down. Harriet held her hand and did not say anything because what Britta had said was complete and did not require addition. The cabin was warm around them. The walls were hung with the quilts and blankets Britta had put there 42 years ago, worn and faded now, but still holding, still maintaining the 2-inch gap, still doing their patient work. The work of the old woman's hands preserved in the fabric itself, still functioning, still warm. My mother said, Britta began. Harriet waited. She said that winter is not an enemy. It is a fact, like the sun or the rain or the distance between places. You do not fight facts. You understand them. You find where the heat goes and you stop it there. You find where the cold comes from and you put something in its way. She was quiet for a moment, her eyes closed. Still air, dead air, air that does nothing. In doing nothing, it does everything. She smiled at something Harriet couldn't see. You tell the others, she said. I will. Harriet said. Britta Solberg died that evening peacefully in the cabin she had kept warm for 42 years. Harriet sat with her until the end and then did what needed doing in the careful, methodical way she did everything and drove home in the dark on the road she had come to know in all its seasons. The funeral was attended by more people than had attended any funeral in Harlan County in recent memory. By June of 1886, Britta was known in the county in a way she had not been in October of 1884, not as the strange Swedish woman past the creek, but as the woman who had known the thing that changed the arithmetic of winter, who had carried the knowledge for 40 years without anyone thinking to ask for it, who had answered every question put to her with the patience of someone who had been waiting a long time for the asking. Constance Morrow spoke at the funeral. She stood at the front of the church which had been hung that spring, all 4 walls on Constance's insistence, and at the Reverend's bewildered assent, and she said that Britta Solberg had possessed knowledge that this community had failed to seek, and that the failure was the community's and the knowledge was hers, and that the least they could do going forward was to say her name when they talked about dead air and 2-inch gaps in warm cabins, and the understanding that winter was a fact to be understood rather than a force to be fought. She said this in the substantial voice that had run the Women's Auxiliary for 20 years, standing in a church that was warm on a fraction of the wood it had been burning 12 months before, and the room was full and quiet and listening. Harriet sat in the third pew and looked at the walls and thought about the chain. Mother to daughter Sweden. to Minnesota Britta, to Edmund's piece of paper, to Harriet's pocket, to the bench outside the store, to the first peg in the north wall, to Nora Patton's cabin, to Gerald Foss's neighbors, to Thomas Alcott's careful arithmetic, to this room full of people who now knew what dead air was and what it was worth. Chains like that did not break easily once enough links had been added. The autumn of 1888 came in the way autumns come when you have learned to read them with the specific quality of September light. That means winter is not a threat but a schedule, something to be prepared for with knowledge, rather than dreaded with ignorance. Harriet was in her garden on an afternoon in early October when she heard a wagon on the road and looked up to see it stop at the Fenwick place, the cabin that had sat dark since old Martin Fenwick had gone to live with his daughter in Iowa 2 months before. Someone had taken the claim. She watched from the garden. A woman climbed down from the wagon, younger than Harriet, which covered a range. She stood in front of the dark cabin with the expression Harriet recognized completely, the expression of a person doing arithmetic that does not work, looking at a cabin, at the sky, at the absence of a woodpile, at the sky again. Harriet pulled off her garden gloves. She walked across the field. The woman's name was Clara Brent. She was 34 years old and had come from Illinois with her husband, who had broken his leg 3 weeks into the journey west and was laid up in a rooming house in town and would not be walking on that leg for 2 more months, which put them at the start of winter with a claim to establish and a cabin to prepare and a man who could not swing an axe. She told Harriet this on the doorstep of the dark cabin in a voice that was holding itself together by concentration alone. Harriet listened. She thought about October of 1884, about the arithmetic that did not work, about the 7 weeks she had counted instead of months, because months felt too large to survive. She thought about a note in a toolbox, about a bench outside a store, about a woman with white braided hair who had said knowledge does not disappear because no one listens to it. It waits for the person who will sit down. "Come inside," Harriet said. "I have something to show you." She would have spent the rest of that afternoon with Clara Brent and the whole of the next 2 mornings. But when she arrived at the Fenwick cabin the following morning at 8 o'clock, she found that someone had gotten there before her. Constance Morrow was in the front room. She had a coil of rope over one arm and a paper of nails in her hand, and she was showing Clara Brent the north wall, pointing to the place where the first peg needed to go. 2 inches, Constance was saying. Away from the wall, not against it. That's the part that matters most. The gap is the mechanism. Harriet stood in the doorway. Constance looked up. She had the expression of a woman who had arrived early on purpose and was not embarrassed about it. She held Harriet's gaze for a moment with something in her face that was not quite an apology and not quite a statement, and was perhaps both of those things at once compressed into the simplest possible form. "I thought she might need help," Constance said. She paused. "I thought I might be useful." Clara Brent looked between the 2 women with the quick, perceptive attention of someone who understands she is standing at the edge of a history she doesn't know yet. Harriet came inside. She hung her coat on the peg by the door. She picked up the hammer from the toolbox on the floor. She had brought her own tools, as she always did when she came to help someone hang their walls. And she looked at the north wall and then at Constance. "You've got the gap measurement right," she said. "I measured," Constance said. "Twice." They worked through the morning. The 3 of them, the 71-year-old woman who had learned the technique from a note in a toolbox, written by a man who learned it from a Swedish woman, who learned it from her mother in Uppsala, the 69-year-old woman who had spent a winter being wrong about what it was worth and had spent the subsequent years making that right, and the 34-year-old woman who would spend the next 30 winters warm because of what was being hung on her walls this morning. They did not need to talk through the work. The work had its own logic, and they each understood their part in it, and they moved through the cabin with the easy coordination of people who are working toward the same thing and know where the pieces go. By noon, the north wall was finished. Clara stood back and looked at it, the heavy fabric hanging straight and still, the 2-inch gap consistent from one end to the other, the dead air already beginning its patient, invisible work between the quilt and the logs. "Will it work?" she asked. Harriet thought about November of 1884, about the first peg, about the hammer that was heavier than she remembered it, and the walls that were harder than she had expected, and the evening she lit the stove and sat down and waited, and the warmth that came, and the morning she woke up and the room was still warm. "Yes," she said, "it will work." "Will I be able to teach someone else?" Clara asked. Later, I mean. When I know it well enough. The way you taught me. Harriet looked at Constance. Constance looked at the wall with its careful gap and its straight hanging fabric. She looked at it the way you look at something you understand the full value of because you once did not understand it and know the difference between those two states. Yes, Constance said, that is exactly what you do next. She said it with the particular weight of someone who has already done it and knows what it costs and what it returns. They finished the east wall before the light changed, and Harriet brought quilts from her own cabin. For the west wall, she had more than she needed, now her supply having grown as people brought things to her in the years since that first winter. And by late afternoon, the cabin was hung on 3 walls, with the 4th to be completed the following morning. Harriet lit a small fire in the stove before she left. They sat together for a while, the 3 of them, in the not yet fully warm cabin, and Harriet told Clara what she always told anyone she taught. This came from a woman named Britta Solberg, who brought it from Sweden, who learned it from her mother. You are the latest in a long line. Pass it forward with the name attached. Clara repeated the name. Britta Solberg. She said it the way you repeat a name when you intend to remember it. Good, Harriet said. She drove home in the October evening, on the road she had driven for 22 years, past fields she knew by name, past the creek where Britta Solberg's cabin stood empty now, but still warm in memory, past the places where the people she had loved had moved through the world. She was 71 years old. She had outlasted a winter that was supposed to finish her, in a community that had organized the sale of her furniture, in a grief that had sat on her chest for months like a stone that had learned her specific weight. She had hung her walls and kept her heat and kept her claim and kept her land, and the claim was proved now and the land was hers by law and by the labor of 11 years and by the one additional winter that had required her to understand what she was made of. She had 4 cords of wood in the yard and quilts on every wall and a note folded in her pocket that she had carried every day for 4 years. She pulled into the yard as the last light went amber and then gray. She unhitched the horse and measured out the grain and checked the water trough, which was developing its first thin skin of ice along the edges of October, doing what October did, making its preparations, getting ready for what came next. She went inside. She lit the lamp. She lit the stove, one piece of good hardwood, because one piece was sufficient because the walls were doing their work and the dead air was doing its work, and the warmth she had built into the fabric of this place was still there, still patient, still present, still holding. She sat at the table where Edmund had sat across from her for 31 years. She took his note from the pocket of her dress. She had carried it every day for 4 years. The paper had softened with handling until the creases were white and the folds were part of the paper rather than interruptions in it. The ink was still clear in Edmund's careful hand. She had memorized it within the first week of carrying it, but she still read it because reading it was different from remembering it. Look into this before next winter. She looked at it for a long time, at the words and at the spaces between the words, at the handwriting that was so thoroughly his, that seeing it still carried his particular quality of attention, the care he gave to things he meant, the precision of a man who understood that writing something down was a way of treating it seriously before next winter. She thought about what he had meant when he wrote it, the easy assumption of continuity built into the phrase, the expectation of another winter together, the small practical gift he had been planning to give her. She thought about all the next winters that had come since the one he meant, 4 of them. Now each one warmer than the previous 4 winters had been each one spent in a cabin that understood heat, the way Britta's mother had taught, and Britta had carried across an ocean, and Edmund had heard about and written down, and she had found and acted on. She thought about Clara Brent in the Fenwick cabin, and the fire she had lit in the stove there, and the warmth that would be holding when Clara woke up tomorrow. She thought about Constance Morrow's voice saying that's the part that matters most in the same room where 4 years ago, Constance had said you can't prove up this claim without Edmund. She thought about Britta on the bench in October, 2 fingers held up and the patience of 42 years of waiting in them. She folded Edmund's note along its worn creases. She held it for a moment. Then she set it on the table in front of her instead of returning it to her pocket. She set it where she could see it, where it would be the first thing she saw in the morning when she came to the table for her coffee in the light that would come through the south window, when she raised the panel in the warmth that the walls would have held through the night without asking anything of the fire. She left it there. Outside, the October wind moved across Harlan County, feeling its way along the walls of 100 cabins. Most of them hung now, most of them holding their quiet, invisible layers of dead air against whatever the season was preparing to bring. The cold was a fact. In facts, a woman from Sweden had once said, "You do not fight, you understand them. You find where the heat goes and you stop it there. You find where the cold comes from and you put something in its way. Something as simple as air that has nowhere to go. Something as ordinary as warmth that has been shown how to stay."